today we're going to talk about the importance of developing assessment, and importantly the difference between an assessment tool versus an assessment instrument. Part of this process we're going to look at the content of a unit descriptor and just break that down briefly, and we're also going to look at the assessment requirements that align with the unit descriptor. So Kate, perhaps you might want to walk us through the difference between an assessment instrument versus an assessment tool.
Sure. So an assessment instrument is the actual form, such as an observation record or a knowledge assessment where the students put in their answers to questions. And it's the actual thing you use when you're completing the assessment or you're reviewing the students' assessment materials. The tool is much bigger, so the tool encompasses both the assessment instrument as well as all the instructions for the student of how, when to complete the assessment, under what conditions to complete the assessment, as well as on top of that there's also the instructions for the assessor, so who can assess, how, when, the timing, the conditions, the equipment required, the location, all of those things the assessor needs to know. So it encompasses the instructions for the student, the instructions for the assessor, as well as the actual assessment requirements that the student is undertaking. So the form or the
That's good. I think perhaps really importantly as well is in that assessment context with regards to the trainer and the assessor, it also provides a marking guide.
Yes.
For consistency with regards to our grading. Marking guide is really important, isn't it, for that consistency process, for the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment. Really important. All of that stuff. Really.
It is, yes. It ensures that the learner has the best chance of completing the assessment in a fair and just manner.
So let's take a moment and let's discuss how do we actually go about developing the assessment process. So initially we're looking at a unit of competence. Doesn't matter what the unit of competence is. And to do that we're looking at the unit descriptor. Now the unit descriptor will have the elements. First of all, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the elements, we're looking at the performance criteria, and of course we're also looking at the application of the overall unit of competence. So if we're looking at the application is basically the introduction, that first paragraph, and it defines things such as what is the context within the industry with regards to the knowledge and the skills that the learner will develop. If we look at the elements, we're looking at the overall key goals of the unit of competence, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. It's really important when you first go to start developing an assessment instrument or tool or assessment for a whole unit of competence is to read through the entire unit of competence. Make sure you've read the application, the elements, the performance criteria.
Then we're looking at the performance criteria, and the performance criteria relate to those almost like subheadings of these are the skills, these are the knowledge, and this is the level that the student is expected to perform at in order to achieve
They're
competence.
more specific benchmarks, aren't they?
Certainly are.
Yeah, they give more of a description of what the performance looks like that the student needs to achieve.
That's right. And then down below, and perhaps worthy of a totally separate conversation, is the heading of foundation skills. Complex but worthwhile and certainly important to discuss.
It is, and that does need to be embedded into your assessment tool or assessment instrument as you develop it. But it is a separate discussion.
Then you have a separate document nowadays with streamlined qualifications and training packages that have come in, titled Assessment Requirements. And within assessment requirements, we'll have things like...
the performance evidence and the knowledge evidence.
That's right. So the performance evidence are those key areas, again, directly linked to the performance criteria. And also it will clearly define how often the performance, that performance evidence must be demonstrated.
Yeah, and it's important to note that sometimes they won't give a numerical figure of how many times a student has to demonstrate their skills in an area, and it will say if it's not, then it has to be demonstrated at least once. But if it says once, that's a summative. That's not the first time the student tries it. So there needs to be formative assessment, and there needs to be practice before the student actually attempts that as their evidence that they've completed the performance.
Yeah. What about knowledge evidence? Where do we go from there?
Yeah, so the knowledge evidence describes the knowledge the student needs to demonstrate to show that they have the skills, knowledge and rationale to practice safely in those performance evidence and performance criteria.
That's right. And then we move into the assessment conditions. Really importantly, these are not negotiable. These are clearly defined by industry when the training package is developed. So you can't look at it and say, well, I don't want to do this. I'll contextualise it and change it to this. So it's really important to get those assessment conditions clearly and accurately defined within your assessment process.
And there are things like the documents that may be required, such as workplace policies and procedures that have to be referred to. It could be equipment that has to be used. It might be, in mining, it could be that they have to drive a dump truck so many times, or they have to have access to a mining site, or it can talk about the physical location or the physical equipment that's required to conduct assessment. And
the conditions. So often you'll see things like it has to be conducted under these conditions. So it might be night shift.
Yep.
Might be a key component, depending on your industry and your needs.
That's right.
It also relates to things like team relationships and who's involved with the assessment and contingency planning. So, the assessment process shouldn't be a perfectly smooth flowing process. It should be controlled by the assessor, but there should be some unexpected things that do get planned deliberately so that the student has to demonstrate how they can problem solve.
The other thing it will say is whether it's simulated or it has to be on the job.
Yeah. Very important. So again, those things are not up for negotiation. Those things have to be addressed within the assessment tool that you're developing, the assessment process that you're developing.
Yes, so because the unit of competence and the assessment requirements are endorsed components of the training package. So every part of them has to be adhered to when you're developing assessment for the student. So before they're deemed competent in a unit, you have to have assessed all of those parts, both documents.
Absolutely. So I think that's in a summary. That's the process that we're trying to look at when we're developing really strong assessment practices. Key component is the student is always the centre of attention when we're developing this assessment process.